Outcast: A New Beginning is an exploration-driven science fiction adventure game boasting lush visuals, memorable characters, and a unique selection of mechanics. But dig deeper, and you'll discover a rich history that goes back decades. More than 20 years in the making, Outcast: A New Beginning feels like a true sequel to the 1999 original that many believed would never happen. It just so happens that the original Outcast remains a very special game for me personally and stands as one of my favorite PC games of all time. Shrouded in mystery, Outcast pushed the boundaries of what a video game could be, both in terms of design and hardware requirements, yet the planned sequel for PlayStation 2 was cancelled when Appeal went under, and it was long thought dead. Now, under the guiding hand of many of its original creators, Outcast has finally received the sequel we've been waiting for. So in this video, brought to you by Digital Foundry and THQ Nordic, I'd like to take you on a journey exploring Outcast: A New Beginning and the games leading up to its creation so you can better understand the legacy of this series. So let's dive into the world of Adelpha and chart the rise, fall, and rebirth of Outcast. When I first loaded up Outcast: A New Beginning, I didn't know what to expect. It had been so long since my last journey to Adelpha, and so much had changed since its release, yet it wasn't long before the magic returned. There really is something here, which we'll get to later in this video. But I want to start by considering the game's subtitle, A New Beginning. It fittingly describes Cutter's quest across the new game, but it equally applies to developer Appeal Studios' journey as well. And to fully understand this, we need to flash back all the way to 1995. The founders of Appeal partnered with publisher Infogrames and started work on Outcast, but the concepts they had in mind were vast and would take time to develop. Thus, during this development, Infogrames requested an interim title, something smaller in scope that they could develop and release while work on Outcast continued. That game is called No Respect. Published under the Ocean Software banner, No Respect comfortably sits within the still popular car combat genre. It's a one-on-one vehicle-based combat game with both single and multiplayer components. This is the first game Appeal would release, and you can really feel the developer's roots in the Amiga and arcade scene. There is some serious technical wizardry on display here. You see, rather than opting for increasingly popular polygon rendering accelerated by a new wave of 3D graphics cards, Appeal instead built a voxel-based engine that's run entirely in software. The terrain itself is perhaps not a true voxel system, mind you, instead relying on a 2D height map to calculate the height of the terrain, but it's effective and enables more complex world building than a traditional polygon-based renderer could at the time. It's from this point that Appeal was able to refocus on the Outcast project, and despite some delays, the game would finally see the light of day in 1999. Outcast is a bold statement and a true example of cutting-edge design both in terms of technology and gameplay. When it arrived on shelves, there was virtually nothing else like it. Outcast opens with a lengthy CG sequence setting up the game's story. Scientists have opened a gate to a parallel dimension, but an energy spike from that other world has basically resulted in a doomsday scenario in which the Earth is being sucked inside. As Cutter Slade, the Jack O'Neill equivalent for this game, you travel to this alternative world with a plan, but that plan immediately crumbles, leaving you stranded. The locals believe you to be a savior, and your journey begins. While they did lean on some of the typical sci-fi tropes, Outcast does a tremendous job with its world and character building in a way that allows it to quickly become its own thing. Every character occupying this world has something to say. There's a full dialogue system with many topics to explore. The use of jargon actually works pretty well, and the voice acting brings these characters to life.
This is going to be bad, isn't it?
Yes, Ulukai. I do not know where the mon is. Please forgive me, but the shamas before me would reverted before telling the secret of the mon.
That's okay. It's what I expected with the kind of day I'm having.
There's a richness to the dialogue system in this game that you just didn't see in similar action games of the era. The real star of the show, however, is Adelpha itself. Appeal ran with its voxel terrain concept and coupled this with a more advanced 3D polygon engine to create this sort of hybrid solution. As a result, the shapes, design, and overall look of the world feels wholly unique. Most games using this sort of terrain system were vehicle-based, but Outcast allows players to freely explore on foot with complex architecture at an immense scale. Of course, anyone that played it at the time of release is likely familiar with its steep system requirements. Outcast relies entirely on software rendering without support for hardware acceleration. As a result, it was limited initially to a max resolution of just 512 by 384, but most PCs wouldn't even be able to deliver that. I'm playing on a Pentium 3 system here, clocked at 700 MHz, and the frame rate is still usually below 30. However, much like 2007's Crysis, it's one of those instances where I can look back and forgive when considering everything that was attempted with this game. Firstly, Outcast feels like a massive open world game long before we really saw such games at this scale. There was a real sense of mystery as you explored Adelpha, and each map is large and seamless. You'll spot beautiful rolling terrain everywhere, countless buildings you can enter without loading screens. Nearly every single NPC has dialogue options, and they all exhibit impressive AI behavior. But it's the visuals that are perhaps most impressive. What was achieved in software rendering here is simply unbelievable. Beyond the already impressive voxel terrain system, Outcast boasts effective edge anti-aliasing. Many surfaces use texture filtering that you'd normally only see on a hardware-accelerated game. The water is legendary, with beautiful reflections, ripples, and depth simulation. It looks unbelievable even now. There's height fog as well that allows distant peaks to poke out from the mist. They use proper inverse kinematics for foot placement. Gorgeous particles accentuate battle sequences, and they even implement things like depth of field used during dialogue sequences, something that basically hadn't existed in games prior. It has its rough edges, sure, but I think what they produced is genuinely beautiful and looks unlike anything else from that era. I was surprised at how easily I was able to jump right back into the world of Outcast and enjoy it. Plus, the remarkable soundtrack performed by the Moscow Symphony Orchestra is the cherry on top.
Metal detected.
Gameplay-wise, Outcast feels equally groundbreaking. There's an unprecedented level of freedom on offer. The exploration, quests, it feels like a game from the future in that sense. There really wasn't anything like this on the market in 1999, save for some of the more classic RPGs, but none of them had really achieved this at such a large 3D scale. Even things like the combat system feels modern. You hold the right mouse button to bring up an aiming reticle with an over-the-shoulder camera. That feels like something that would only begin to appear years later. I'm really only just scratching the surface here, but Outcast is, in my book, a groundbreaking masterpiece of a PC game and one that pushed the platform to its limits. Unfortunately, after release, things didn't quite go as planned. According to Frank Sauer, one of Outcast's chief designers and co-founder of Appeal, they got to work on a sequel to Outcast right away. And this time it would be designed for a console, specifically the PlayStation 2, which was just around the corner. While the hardware was rather exotic and difficult to work on initially, the team built an impressive prototype and screenshots quickly made their rounds. I specifically remember being floored by the initial shots, and my anticipation went through the roof. It quickly became one of my most anticipated games for the system. Unfortunately, things didn't work out, and the project was canned. And after another failed pitch for a Tantan game, Appeal went bankrupt in 2002. For a time, it felt as if this marked the end of Outcast, but the spirit lived on. Firstly, remnants of the PS2 version of Outcast, specifically the graphics engine, lived on in a pair of extreme sports titles developed by a newly formed company called Fresh 3D. Fresh 3D was founded by Jan Robert and Frank Sauer, two co-founders of Appeal. While the gameplay is obviously unrelated to Outcast, the technology powering them was very impressive and was built on some of the work that had been done for Outcast 2. In some ways, they felt like a repeat of 1997's No Respect, projects necessary to get a foothold in the market once again. In addition, some of the original Appeal staff were also involved in the development of Fighter Within for Ubisoft, a Kinect-based launch title for Xbox One. They worked under the name Daoka, the same title applied to the portals throughout the world of Outcast. But behind the scenes, something was stirring. After quietly joining forces once again, the three original founders of Appeal managed to reacquire the rights to Outcast from Atari, and a plan was hatched to launch a Kickstarter for what they called Outcast Reboot HD.
Now it's 15 years later, and the technology has advanced a great deal. We can now create immersive worlds like never before, and our plan is quite simple. What we want to do now is recreate Outcast in high-definition glory with full details for your latest machine.
Excited by the prospect, I was one of the Kickstarters for this game. I put in a pledge, but as you can see, the project state is listed as unsuccessful because unfortunately, the funding goal was not met. And it seemed once again that Outcast may remain in the past. That is until December 2014, when suddenly a new version of Outcast arrived on Steam, known as Outcast 1.1. This is a modern retooling of the original game built on the original source code, but now supporting high-resolution rendering, improved controls, and more. It's basically designed to bring the original Outcast to modern platforms, while keeping the experience fully intact. New visual features were added, such as the option to filter all polygon mesh textures, and it feels very faithful to the original, as it should. While we did not get the promised HD iteration of Outcast at this time, it was still a great moment for fans of the original, and I still recommend it for those curious about the original Outcast. But there's more. Just 3 years later, in 2017, now under the name Appeal once again, the developers had their chance to make an HD version of Outcast. Published by Big Ben, Outcast Second Contact is basically an HD remake of the original game built in the Unity engine. It offered the team a chance to revisit that world properly and redo everything. While certain aspects were divisive, I still greatly enjoyed returning to Adelpha once again, seen through a new lens. The team recreated everything from the ground up with intent to channel that original atmosphere while updating the visuals and gameplay for modern standards. There's a lot more to it, of course, but for the purposes of this video, it served as a very important stepping stone. You see, Outcast Second Contact is the game that would allow Appeal to finally, after all this time, build the sequel to Outcast. And it's here that we reconnect with Outcast, A New Beginning. Welcome back to Adelpha, the Adelpha that almost did not exist, and a love letter to longtime fans of the series. Outcast: A New Beginning truly feels like the game Appeal wanted to create all the way back in the early 2000s. From the comparable concept art to the narrative beats and more, it all lines up with what we know about that cancelled sequel. In that sense, it's amazing to see that the creators have held on to these ideas for so long, only now having the opportunity to implement them. But the gaming landscape of 2024 is radically different to that of the early 2000s. The original Outcast arrives at a time when free-form open-world exploration games largely weren't a thing. Now, however, open-world games have become almost the default design. Furthermore, the size, scope, and budgets of these types of games have skyrocketed. Competing at that AAA level is expensive and difficult, and Outcast: A New Beginning is not one of those games, but that's okay. What we have instead is a game that isn't afraid to let the player run free. It's a little scruffy around the edges, sure, but it's both very much a sequel to Outcast and a breath of fresh air in a packed market segment. This isn't a review, mind you, but I do want to share both the ways in which it's comparable to the original game, while also discussing some of the new things it does really well. To that first point, A New Beginning builds directly on Outcast's original foundation. Just like that game, you're free to run off in any direction, tackling missions in any order you wish. The Talon return and are just as eager to speak with the player as in the original game. There's so much dialogue, in fact, that it's almost staggering. The back and forth between Cutter and the locals remains just as engaging as ever. Plus, the feeling of slowly learning more about the mission, taking on tasks, and just exploring really works as it did in the original Outcast. It's clear that a great attention to detail was poured into ensuring that this game is consistent with the lore and the experience of that initial game. Which is interesting, as in 2024, I'd imagine most people playing this are not familiar with that original, yet they still took the time to make sure they got it right. What separates this new game from the rest of the pack, however, largely comes down to the design of the world itself and the tools the players are given to explore it. In the original game, it was broken up into distinct areas that were accessible using the Daokas. The Daokas have returned here, though they're disabled by default, and restoring them is part of your mission. But the world itself is now an integrated, seamless whole with no additional loading screens. That was initially a cause for concern, as I was afraid it would rob the game of variety, but that's absolutely not the case. Each and every locale you visit across Adelpha is extremely unique, both in terms of the visual design and the gameplay layout. Specifically, there's a real verticality here that we don't often see in large open world games these days. A playfulness that is perhaps more reminiscent of a 3D platform game than a typical open world one. So let me share one example where it really clicked for me. I decided to make my way to the desert area off here in the north. Far from the distance, you can already spot these huge spires towering above the land. There's clearly something up there. So I fought my way across the desert, taking out a base on the way to the spire. Using your jetpack, you can blast across the terrain at high speeds, and of course, you can leap far into the air. And that's key to the actual climbing of the spire, because there is no climbing system. That modern-style hotspot-driven climbing just isn't in the game. Instead, it's a platformer. You, with your jetpack, are able to leap vertically into the sky while finding your own way up to the top. There is a planned route, so to speak, but you can also kind of make your own. There's a ton of stuff to see on your way up the spire, and that journey was a lot of fun. All told, it took me nearly half an hour to reach the village situated at the top of the spire, and it's that journey specifically that really sold me on the game. Upon arrival, I was greeted by this beautiful city built on the spire, with its own citizens and problems to solve. And yeah, many of the missions are fetch questy, but due to the freedom of movement and the atmosphere of just being up here, it never really felt tedious. The typical guardrails are not in effect here. For instance, if you just jump off the top of the spire here, you can fall all the way down to the ground. You won't die thanks to the jetpack, but there's no way to fast travel back to the top unless you've restored the Daoka. Just this little nugget of knowledge that you could just jump off and lose all that progress in a heartbeat somehow made it more enticing. The developers avoided putting guardrails across the game, and you can just kind of fly and jump around wherever the heck you want. That's really the biggest gameplay hook, the feeling of movement. It's sublime and fun. Of course, this is a departure from the original game, which is a much slower paced affair, but in the age of large open world titles with slower realistic movement, the jetpack really elevates the experience, literally. As I suggested earlier though, it's really more like a large exploration-driven platform game rather than a typical modern open world title. Of course, combat is also something you'll be dealing with throughout the game, and this was a weak point in the original title, but given the time of its release, it was acceptable, I'd say. The new game, however, does a better job than I might have anticipated. The freedom of movement I discussed earlier also basically applies to combat. You can mix and match parts to transform your weapons into whatever you want, and jump around with your jetpack and just take on enemies from all angles. It's not exactly a difficult game, mind you, even on the harder settings, but they did a good job with the impact animations and overall snappiness, so it does feel satisfying to dispatch your foes. They even tried their hand at some boss fights during certain sections of the game. But really, when you step back and look at both titles, it's clear that A New Beginning is functionally a different experience compared to the original, but the overarching design remains authentic, I feel. That is, in both cases, you're exploring the world of Adelpha, talking with the Talon, while chipping away at various challenges and missions that are seamlessly integrated into the world. The joy of exploration is a key tenet on which the game is built. and the pleasure derived from exploration directly hinges on the world itself and the way in which it's presented. So the original game, as I highlighted, looked unlike anything else at the time. It was cutting edge for 1999. Yet these days, it's a lot more difficult to innovate on the tech side. In that sense, Outcast: A New Beginning isn't really pushing any boundaries in comparison. It is an Unreal Engine 4 based game after all, and the visual features are all rather standard to boot. However, as you may have seen from my capture thus far, the art direction and layout do a lot of heavy lifting. The sheer level of variety on offer, combined with a granular level of detail, certainly impresses. The forests around Amiya, for instance, almost feel like a reference to the classic game Flashback, but in full 3D. While the towering desert spires are always breathtaking. The coastal town is also beautiful, as is the lava-filled volcanic area. Each of these locations has its own visual identity, and all of them are tied together seamlessly. Smaller details also fare well. Most plant life, for instance, exhibits touch bending, reacting to Cutter's movements as you brush past them. The water, of course, produces ripples, much like the original game, as you'd expect, and you can still dive beneath the surface to explore the watery depths below. What really surprises me, though, is how different each of the aforementioned areas feel. When you're exploring the heart of the jungle or digging into ancient temples, it genuinely feels separated and distant from the rest of civilization. It's truly an isolated sensation you get from exploring these areas. I especially appreciate how each of the game's towns that you visit feel functionally different from one another. And if you look closely, you'll even spot references to the original Adelpha from Outcast 1. The risk fields, for instance, were instantly recognizable, and not just due to the visuals, but also the audio, which is another important part of the game. Lenny Moore returns to score Outcast: A New Beginning with a powerful orchestral score, beautifully channeling familiar themes into new pieces of music that complement your journey. Honestly, it's amazing stuff and just as powerful as I had hoped. When taking all of this together, I really think it's fascinating to see what this game has become. Unlike the original, it's not a revolutionary game per se, but the team has still managed to differentiate this game from other open world titles in the market. There is a passion here behind the work that impressed me. It's clear that it was created by people that truly care about the legacy of Outcast. It's not perfect, but it's an interesting game with a strong legacy behind it, and sometimes that's enough.